the night Ukraine destroyed something Russia considers almost mythological. A ground-based launcher carrying the Zircon hypersonic missile, a weapon Vladimir Putin personally called unstoppable. The entire logic of Russian deterrence cracked open in a way that almost no one in mainstream media has honestly explained. What you are about to understand in the next 26 minutes is not simply the story of a drone strike in occupied Crimea on the night of March 24, 2026. It is the story of how a nation that Russia expected to erase from the map in 72 hours has now reached deep inside the most protected peninsula in the Black Sea. The sea hunted down a convoy of the most expensive and technologically advanced weapons in Moscow's arsenal while they were moving in the dark toward their firing positions, and destroyed them before a single missile could be launched at a Ukrainian city. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the Zircon is not just another missile, why destroying it on a mobile launcher in motion is one of the most technically sophisticated military achievements of this entire war, what it reveals about the collapse of Russia's intelligence and air defense architecture in Crimea, and why the geopolitical consequences of this single strike extend far beyond Ukraine, into the war rooms of Beijing, the defense ministries of Europe, and the strategic calculations of every nation that has been watching Russia's so-called hypersonic revolution with fear. You will not find this level of analysis explained this clearly or this honestly anywhere else today. Let us start with what actually happened on that night, because the details matter enormously, and most coverage has buried them. Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, known by its Ukrainian acronym GUR, announced on March 24, 2026, that drone operators from its Department of Unmanned tracked a convoy of Russian Bastion-M coastal missile system launchers moving through occupied Crimea toward their firing positions. The PUR stated that precise strikes destroyed one launcher along with two Zircon hypersonic missiles loaded on it, damaged a second Bastion launcher, and killed or wounded 7 Russian service members. The agency published exclusive video footage of the strike, and then it stated something that tells you everything about the strategic significance of this operation. Russia had planned to use those Zircon missiles that very night as part of a large-scale attack on Ukrainian cities. The strike did not just destroy hardware, it intercepted a mass casualty event before it could happen. If you have spent years consuming international news and always walked away feeling like the real story, the historical context, the strategic reality, the truth underneath the headline was always just out of reach, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe right now and hit like, because this is not a headline channel. This is a channel that gives you the architecture, the history, and the honest analysis that mainstream media is simply not structured to provide. You deserve the full picture, not a curated fragment of it. Now let us understand what the Zircon actually is, because without that context, the strike does not carry its full weight. The 3M22 Zircon is a hypersonic cruise missile developed by Russia over more than a decade, with its adoption into service becoming formally known in 2023. It travels at speeds between Mach 8 and Mach 9, meaning it moves at roughly 8 to 9 times the speed of sound, somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 kilometers per hour. At those speeds, it can cover 400 to over 1,000 kilometers in a time frame so compressed that conventional air defense systems have almost no reaction window. Vladimir Putin stood in front of the Russian parliament and called it a weapon against which there is no defense. He tied it directly to Russia's strategic deterrence posture. He used it as the central exhibit in his argument that Russia had leapt ahead of the West technologically, and that any Western military planning against Russia was obsolete. The Zircon was not just a weapon. It was the cornerstone of a narrative, and that narrative just got hit by a Ukrainian drone on a dark road in Crimea. To understand why this moment is historically significant, you have to go back further than most analysts are willing to go. You have to understand how Crimea became the staging ground it is today, and why Russia thought that peninsula was permanently beyond Ukrainian reach. When Russia seized Crimea from Ukraine in February and March of 2014, it did not simply annex territory. It seized the strategic key to the Black Sea. Crimea juts southward into the Black Sea like a fist, and whoever controls it controls access to the sea lanes connecting Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia. The Soviet Union had understood this perfectly. The Russian Black Sea Fleet had been based at Sevastopol in Crimea since 1783, when Catherine the Great established the city specifically for that purpose. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, Russia and newly independent Ukraine negotiated an arrangement allowing Russia to lease the Sevastopol base. For 2 decades, that arrangement held. When Russia took Crimea, it immediately began militarizing the peninsula at a scale that shocked Western intelligence assessments. It deployed S-400 air defense systems, moved Bastion coastal defense batteries to the peninsula, stationed nuclear-capable aircraft at Saki Air Base, and built the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland, the longest bridge in Europe, to ensure logistical independence from Ukraine. Territory. By 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Crimea had become what military analysts called the aircraft carrier of the Black Sea, a fortified platform from which Russia could project air, naval, and missile power across the entire region. Russia genuinely believed Crimea was impregnable, and for the first months of the war, that belief appeared justified. But then Ukraine began doing something that rewrote every military assumption anyone held. Not the front lines, not the territory adjacent to Ukraine, the conflict. Crimea itself, deep inside what Russia considered sovereign territory, protected by the most sophisticated air defense network Moscow could assemble. In August 2022, Ukraine struck Saki Air Base, destroying multiple Russian combat aircraft in what Russia initially denied, then was forced to acknowledge. In October 2022, Ukraine struck the Kerch Bridge in a truck bomb operation that was so audacious it made front pages around the world. In September 2023, a Ukrainian missile strike hit the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol directly. One by one, Ukraine demonstrated that the mythology of Crimea's invulnerability was exactly that, mythology. By 2025 and into 2026, Ukraine had systematically dismantled Russia's air defense architecture across Crimea. Official Ukrainian data from the winter of 2025 to 2026 indicates that Ukrainian forces struck more than 80 Russian air defense systems during that period alone, including Pantsir systems, Tor systems, S-300 launchers, and the critically important radar systems that are the eyes without which no air defense network can function. When you destroy radars, you do not just degrade one system. You create blind spots across an entire integrated network. You make every system in that network less effective because they all depend on shared sensor data. Ukraine understood this with a strategic clarity that honestly deserves far more credit than it receives. The Bastion system itself has a history that gives you the full picture of what happened on March 24, 2026. The K300P Bastion-P, or in its upgraded mobile form, the Bastion-M, was originally designed as a coastal defense system built to destroy the K300P. Enemy warships approaching Russian shores. It fires the P-800 Onyx anti-ship missile, a supersonic weapon designed for naval targets. But as this war evolved, Russia began adapting the Bastion system for land strikes, using it to hit Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure far from the front lines. And then, Russia took an additional step that represented a significant and dangerous escalation. It began integrating the Zircon hypersonic missile into Bastion launchers, giving a ground-based mobile platform the ability to fire what was originally a naval weapon at hypersonic speeds. This adaptation was not widely advertised. It was the kind of quiet, doctrinal evolution that happens in wartime, when one side is running low on other options and needs to maximize every platform it possesses. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. Based on everything we have covered, which player do you think holds the most strategic leverage right now? Put your full analysis in the comments. I read every single one, and I respond to the most interesting takes. And if someone in your life is trying to understand what is really happening here, a friend, a colleague, a family member, share this video with them right now. Because the mainstream version of this story is missing everything we have covered together. And that matters more than you know. Here is what every major outlet is carefully and deliberately avoiding when they cover this story. The destruction of a Zircon-equipped Bastion launcher is not primarily a story about hardware. It is a story about intelligence. Think about what had to happen for this strike to succeed. Ukrainian drone operators had to know the convoy was moving. They had to know its route. They had to track it in real time through occupied territory, in darkness, on a road in a peninsula that Russia has spent 12 years fortifying. They had to get weapons to the convoy's location quickly enough to hit it before it reached its firing position. And they had to do all of this without the convoy knowing it was being tracked. That is not a lucky strike. That is the product of an intelligence architecture that has deeply penetrated Russian operational security in Crimea, and that should terrify Moscow far more than the loss of any individual launcher. The second buried reality is this: the fact that Zircon missiles were on those launchers headed to firing positions that night, and the fact that no Zircon launches were recorded in Ukrainian Air Force data for the March 24 attack is not a coincidence. Ukraine's strike package that night was partly built around preventing those specific missiles from being used. That means Ukrainian intelligence knew in advance that Russia was planning to incorporate Zircon missiles into that night's strike package. The knowledge was actionable, and the action was executed. The public narrative frames this as a successful ambush. The actual strategic reality is that Ukraine is reading Russian strike planning with a degree of precision that suggests sources and methods so sensitive that even Ukraine's official statements are deliberately vague about how this information is obtained. The third hidden dynamic is the Crimea strategic equation itself. Russia's entire military presence in Crimea is now under a level of threat that would have been considered impossible to most military planners in 2022. Every system Russia moves on that peninsula is potentially observable. Every convoy, every launcher, every radar installation moving to a new position is a target. The mobility that made the Bastion system valuable, the ability to fire from one position and move before being struck in return, has been neutralized by Ukraine's persistent drone surveillance. Russia built its Crimea strategy around the assumption that Ukraine could not see everything. That assumption is gone. The fourth reality that mainstream analysis is missing is the broader context of Russia's strike campaign in 2026. Since the start of 2026, Russia has been dramatically escalating the scale of its missile and drone attacks against Ukraine. The March 23rd to 24th attack was described by analysts at the Institute for the Study of War as the closest Russian forces had come to the threshold of launching over 1,000 strike vehicles in a single package. Russia is clearly attempting to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses through sheer volume and diversity of weapons, including drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and now hypersonic weapons deployed from ground-based mobile launchers. This escalation is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of desperation dressed up as firepower. Russia is burning through its most expensive and irreplaceable weapons at an accelerating rate, precisely because the cheaper alternatives are being shot down at higher and higher rates. Ukraine's air defense is improving, even as Russia tries to saturate it. If this channel is giving you geopolitical analysis that you genuinely cannot find anywhere else, subscribe right now. Hit like. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that honest analysis deserves to be seen by more people. And share this video right now with one person who needs the full picture, because understanding the world is not a luxury. It is how you make sense of everything else happening around you. Now let us map the global ripple effects of this strike, because they extend far beyond the Black Sea. The most immediate effect is on Russian deterrence doctrine itself. For years, Moscow's hypersonic missile program served a dual purpose. It was a battlefield weapon, and it was a deterrence signal aimed at NATO. The argument Putin made was simple. We have weapons you cannot intercept. Therefore, do not challenge us. The Zircon was central to that argument. When a Ukrainian drone destroys a Zircon on a mobile launcher before it can fire, the deterrence narrative takes a direct hit. It does not mean the Zircon is ineffective when it does fire. It has been used against Ukrainian cities with devastating effect, but it means that the weapon is not invulnerable at every stage of its operational cycle. Weapons that cannot be launched are weapons that cannot terrorize. The second ripple effect lands in Beijing. China has been watching this war with the careful attention of a nation planning its own future military operations. Chinese military planners have invested heavily in hypersonic missile development. Operating under the same assumption that animated Russia, that hypersonic speed makes interception impossible, and that therefore hypersonic weapons provide a decisive strategic advantage. The lesson from Crimea is more nuanced and more disturbing for Beijing than a simple interception. It destroyed it on the ground before it launched. That means the vulnerability is not in the missile's flight characteristics. It is in the kill chain that gets the missile to the launcher, loads it, moves it to position, and prepares it for launch. Every step of that kill chain is observable, trackable, and targetable. That is a lesson with direct implications for Taiwan contingency planning. The third ripple effect is on European defense thinking. European NATO members have spent the better part of 2 years arguing over how much military aid to send Ukraine and what conditions to attach to that aid. The March 24 strike is evidence that the investments already made in drone technology, in intelligence sharing, in training Ukrainian operators are producing a Ukrainian military capability that is operationally sophisticated beyond what most European capitals publicly acknowledge. The argument for continued and escalated support just got stronger. The argument that Russia's military remains so powerful that supporting Ukraine is futile just got weaker. The fourth ripple extends to the peace negotiations that have been sputtering in the background of all of this battlefield activity. U.S.-Ukrainian talks took place on March 21st and 22nd in Florida. Russia launched its massive strike package in the day's immediate aftermath. Following those talks, a pattern that analysts at ISW noted explicitly, pointing out that Russia times its largest attacks to coincide with the days surrounding peace negotiations. Russia struck immediately after the Florida talks. Ukraine countered the night of March 23rd to 24th by destroying the Zircon launcher in Crimea. Whatever negotiators are saying in conference rooms, the battlefield is sending a different message entirely. And the battlefield message is that neither side believes the other is negotiating in good faith. The fifth ripple is domestic, inside Russia. Vladimir Putin has used the Zircon and the broader hypersonic program as political currency at home. Proof that Russia's military-industrial complex remains world-class, despite sanctions, despite isolation, despite the economic costs of the war. Every time a Zircon launcher burns in Crimea, a small piece of that domestic narrative chars with it. Russian state media will not show the footage that Ukraine's GUR published. But Russians are not blind to the reality that the war has not gone as promised. Now let us walk through 4 scenarios for where this goes from here, because the strike on March 24th is not an endpoint, it is an inflection point. The first scenario is gradual Ukrainian attrition of Russia's missile launch capability across Crimea. In this scenario, Ukraine continues its systematic campaign of destroying Bastion launchers, radar systems, air defense assets, and logistics infrastructure in Crimea at the pace it has established over the winter of 2025 to 2026, building on the 80-plus air defense systems destroyed in that period. The cumulative effect is that Russia's ability to use Crimea as a strike platform against Ukraine degrades month by month. This does not end the war, but it significantly reduces the threat to Ukrainian cities from the south and buys space for Ukraine's air defense to concentrate on threats from other directions. This is the most likely near-term trajectory given current momentum. The second scenario involves Russian escalation in response to the Crimea strikes. Moscow, humiliated by the loss of prestige assets and occupied territory, considers sovereign soil, launches a dramatically larger and more diverse strike package against Ukrainian infrastructure than anything. Seen previously, targeting not just energy and military assets, but attempting to collapse civilian systems entirely ahead of the spring and summer campaign season. In this scenario, Western air defense support becomes the decisive variable. If European and American Patriot systems and interceptor stocks are sufficient, Ukraine absorbs the escalation and continues its campaign. If they are not, civilian suffering in Ukraine intensifies significantly, while the battlefield dynamic remains roughly unchanged. The third scenario is a negotiated pause that locks in current positions. Peace talks that both sides are approaching with profound skepticism produce some form of a ceasefire framework before the spring-summer offensive fully develops. In this scenario, Crimea remains occupied, Ukraine retains its drone capability, and the conflict enters a frozen war phase similar to what we have seen in other post-Soviet conflicts. This scenario is less likely than it might appear, given the gap between what Ukraine requires, restoration of its territorial sovereignty, and what Russia is willing to concede, which appears to be nothing at all. The fourth scenario is the most strategically significant and the least discussed. Ukraine's ongoing destruction of Russian air defense systems in Crimea reaches the threshold where the peninsula becomes genuinely vulnerable to a sustained long-range strike campaign that makes the continued Russian military presence there operationally untenable. This would not require Ukrainian forces to physically retake Crimea. It would require making Crimea too costly to use as a military platform. The Kerch Bridge has already been struck twice. The Black Sea Fleet has already been largely expelled from Sevastopol and moved to Novorossiysk. The Bastion launchers that were supposed to protect the peninsula are being hunted on their own roads. If this trajectory continues, Crimea transitions from an asset that projects Russian power to a liability that absorbs it. My analytical judgment is this. The most likely path combines elements of the first and fourth scenarios. Ukraine will continue its methodical degradation of Russian military infrastructure in Crimea through the spring and summer of 2026. Russia will escalate its strike campaign against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure in parallel, attempting to break civilian morale and pressure Western governments to push Ukraine toward negotiations. The outcome will depend on two variables: whether Western air defense support keeps pace with Russian escalation, and whether Ukraine's intelligence penetration of Russian operational planning in Crimea, demonstrated so vividly on the night of March 24th, can be maintained as Russia inevitably adjusts its practices in response to these losses. Let me close with the 5 geopolitical truths this moment has placed in your hands. First, hypersonic weapons are not invincible. They are vulnerable throughout their entire kill chain, from production to transport to positioning, and Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to exploit that vulnerability with lethal precision. Second, intelligence dominance is more decisive than any individual weapons platform. Ukraine's ability to track Russian missile convoys in real time in occupied territory represents a capability that changes the operational calculus of this war more than any specific weapon. Third, Crimea is no longer the impregnable fortress Russia built it to be. It is contested territory whose military utility is being steadily eroded. Fourth, Russia's escalation is driven by systemic pressure, not strategic confidence. Launching 1,000 strike vehicles.
আসসালামুয়ালাইকুম গাইস, কেমন আছেন আপনারা সবাই? চলে আসলাম আপনাদের মাঝে আরো একটি অসম ভিডিও নিয়ে। দেখতে পাচ্ছেন আমাদের ম্যাচটি ইতিমধ্যে স্টার্ট করে দিয়েছে আমার টিমমেট।
Don't split at this. Stay with the squad.
যদিও পিকে নামবো, যদিও একটু আগে নামার উচিত ছিল।
Group up at my location.
মোবাইলটা অনেক লাইক করতেছে গাইস।
Enemy very close. Help me.
ও হ্যাকার। কি বট শট প্লেয়ার বললো এগুলা। আমরা ইতিমধ্যে আবার একটি রিভাইভ পেয়েছি।
Enemy spotted. Help me!
মোবাইলটা অনেক বেশি ল্যাগ করতেছে গাইস। দেখা যাক গাইস আমি কি আমার টিমমেটকে রিভাইভ পারি। ইতিমধ্যে রিভাইভ দিয়ে দিই।
Need money for items.
আমার নেটটা মোবাইলটা অনেক অনেক বেশি ল্যাগ করতেছে। গাইস আবার চলে আসলাম। ওই টিমমেটটাকে অন্য কেউ রিভাইভ দেয়নি। দেখা যাক কি হয়। ম্যাচটি গিয়ে শেষ পর্যন্ত আমরা খেলতে পারবো।
Head there.
Enemy spotted. Capturing the bubble airdrop.
গাইস এটা ফ্রি ফায়ারের নতুন ইভেন্ট, গেমের মধ্যে এটা অ্যাড করে দিয়েছে ফ্রি ফায়ার। উইনচেস্টার গানটা নিয়ে নিলাম।
Resources here. Capturing the bubble airdrop.
আমি এখন পর্যন্ত কিন্তু করতে পারিনি।
Enemy very close.
দেখা যাক family support করে কিনা
Resources here.
গাইস গুলির শব্দ পাইলাম আমার একটা সাহায্য পাই এনিমি রয়েছে
Enemy spotted. Skill on cooldown. Help me.
দেখ
Enemy very close.
বাইরে ভাই
Double kill.
Go for the arsenal.
Enemy near. I need backup.
প্লেয়ার তাও আবার নিয়ে চলে গেছে দেখে যাক আমাদের কেরি ব্যাগ দিল কত নেট গেলেস
Help me.
Sahur.